Welcome to Moving the Needle on Wicked Problems. And if ever there was a wicked problem, it is climate change. Flooding, droughts, extreme weather events are becoming far more normal as we experience the impacts of climate change. It impacts our cities, our environment, and comes at a human cost for too many. It has also created a significant debate about how we deal with climate change to transition away from traditional reliance on energy resources like oil and gas. And that in turn has triggered another debate, which is how do we look after the people who are traditionally employed in traditional resources like oil and gas. For all of these, we have a terrific panel ahead of you.
Absolutely, Senator. Climate change is a tricky political issue here in Canada. We see significant parts of the country even questioning whether climate change action is necessary. It's actually even sparked a national unity debate in some of the provinces. So you're right. The big question is, how do we tackle climate change, but also bridge this political divide?
So to delve into this conversation, we talked to climate change activist David Miller and former diplomat Ambassador Rosemary McCarney. Let's go listen to what they say. Welcome to Moving the Needle on Wicked Problems. On today's episode, we will be talking about climate change and its impact at the local, national, and international level. To delve into these issues, we are speaking with Rosemary McCarney and David Miller. Rosemary is the past ambassador to the United Nations in Geneva, the Sabia Pearson Distinguished Scholar in International Relations at Trinity College, and the 2020-2021 Foreign and Defense Policy Senior Fellow at Massey College. She is, of course, also with me, a member of the World Refugee and Migration Council. And David Miller, well known to many of us in Canada, is the Director of International Diplomacy for C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group. He was previously the CEO of the World Wildlife Fund of Canada, and of course, a very popular mayor of Toronto when I was also very engaged in local issues. Welcome to both of you. Thank you for taking the time to speak to us today. David, I'm going to start with you with a question about climate change and extreme weather and how it impacts people's daily lives. And we have a real life example from Texas right now. You know, there's extreme weather there. And I know that, lots of climate change experts say the two are not necessarily related. Extreme weather and climate change are not the same, but there is a causal link. Can you explain to us how extreme weather is connected to climate change and whether we can expect more of these, explosions, as I may call them, that hit people at a daily level?
Thanks, Senator, for the question, and thanks for having me on the podcast as well. And hello, Rosemary. Great to be part of this. I look forward to hearing from both of you. I think that's a spot-on question because the extreme weather we're seeing globally, not just in Texas right now with this freak snowstorm, but going back for at least a decade, storms like Hurricane Sandy and others are very connected to climate change. In fact, that's exactly what climate scientists have said for at least 30 years will be happening. More and frequent extreme weather events. And from the perspective of city governments, so not just from my own experience, but from my current work experience, this is a really serious issue. Not just because we need to find ways to stop climate change because it's going to have huge impact on people and on nature, but a very serious practical issue. Hurricane Sandy, for example, cost billions for New York to fix its infrastructure. Toronto, in the face of more extreme weather events, is having to rebuild its storm sewer infrastructure. And one part of that program, when I was in office, was costing $1 billion. Toronto at that time took in $3 billion in tax revenue. So massive expenses. And I think what's happening in Texas shows what what's happened when we're not prepared. There is a debate about whether this snowstorm is caused by climate change or not. We'll know in a few years whether it was. The argument is that the warming of the Arctic has caused this kind of weather. I don't think it matters whether this specific storm is caused by climate change or not. We're going to see more of these kinds of events. And as we've seen in Texas, Texas was not prepared for a storm of this magnitude. Its electricity system wasn't built with the resilience necessary because of its rather unusual market structure. It relied on very high rates in the short term to lower electricity consumption as its response to disasters. And as we've seen, that's completely inadequate. This is what's going to happen in many places, and from a city government's perspective is a huge issue, and probably why many city governments are working so hard to mitigate against climate change, because they know they have to do it.
And Rosemary, what is sort of happening, I guess, on the world stage? I mean, we think about things in a global perspective, but countries are essentially doing what Canada and David just sort of outlined, on a local level in their countries. And I've heard stories of cities having to be completely relocated because of rising sea levels. So can you sort of take us through what's happening on a global scale around climate change and how it's impacting nations around the world?
Sure, and thanks so much for having me, and Senator for the invitation, and hello, David. It's good to see you again as well. I think that the easiest thing to say is that it's differential around the world. Who's getting impacted in what ways, by how much, etc. And certainly there's more vulnerable communities, as there always are, and somewhat less vulnerable communities, but all of us are being impacted. So, whether you think of Canada and these recurring forest fires that are stacking up as they are in the Northwest United States, if you think of the tundra melting and the infrastructural and human displacement in the Canadian Arctic, or you think about the rising sea levels on our coasts, and we have more coastline than any country in the world. And then, of course, as you mentioned, Paul, the Pacific Island states are struggling with rising sea levels that are causing salinization of crops, loss of homes, etc. Africa, you've got droughts that are just recurring, that are they used to be predictable, but now they're not. And so when do farmers plant safely, seeds that are hard to come by? When do we think about irrigation methods? And then, as David said, the US is not immune. Wealthy countries are not immune. We think about it more in terms of infrastructural costs, without question, but resource-rich countries can build dikes and dams and do bylaws on floodplain building, etc. But we can't hold it all back, and therefore you've got massive flooding on the New York coast. You've got hurricanes hitting more with more damage further north, whether it's Halifax or the eastern seaboard. So none of us are immune. We can buy insurance, but that'll only take us so far. So, when you ask about what's the global picture, it's everywhere, but the capacity to habituate or to build resilience or to recover is highly differentiated.
So thanks, Rosemary. We all understand that climate doesn't belong to any one country. It's everywhere. And you and I have worked very closely together on refugee issues, and you and I understand the reasons why people flee their countries: oppression, human rights abuses, corruption. Add climate change to the mix. What do you get?
Well, what a lot of people say is, if you think about climate change, it's a force multiplier for all of the underlying vulnerabilities that exist in any event. And so, you have loss of livelihood, not just farming and agriculture, but loss of livelihood across the piece, loss of markets. You've got salinization of farmlands happening all over the world, so agricultural impacts. People are selling their assets to be able to cope with the impact of climate change. And so when you sell the cattle, when you sell the home, or when you rent out your scarce land, that drawdown of capital that allows some resilience and recovery is gone forever. And, you know, I think one of the things we have to be thoughtful about, and it's not sufficiently yet in the public domain, is the issue of climate change and disease transmission. Whether it's because of more urban density, or whether it's because of loss of land and a natural habitat for animals. So you've got animal to human transmission in a way we have never seen before. And certainly COVID-19 is certainly bringing that into the fore. I think the other thing that perhaps we're becoming more cognizant of is climate-induced conflict. So when you have a massive drought, which leads to hunger, irrecoverable hunger situations, then you've got competition for scarce resources leading to conflict. And so the science is becoming more precise. So people move, absolutely, but there's a conflagration of reasons people move and tipping points why people move. But 60% of the most vulnerable countries in the world are conflict-ridden right now. And they're also the ones already most vulnerable to climate change. So you put those two together, even the UN Security Council, I think it's this week or next week, is going to start talking about this as a security issue.
And it's an interesting discussion because, you know, we've talked about how climate change is impacting everyone and you know, cities, nations, and obviously individuals as well, as Rosemary, you just pointed out, right? I mean, you know, people having to sell their stuff just because they're impacted by climate change, or, you know, we saw in Texas as well, where, you know, if that's linked to climate change or not, we have people that have broken water pipes in their homes, so now they have to pay for it, or their insurance has to pay for it. So it's affecting people. But one of the things that you know, particularly in Canada, but I'm sure it's in other nations as well, including the United States, is that this is a particularly difficult political issue to deal with. You know, there seems to be a discourse around it that's either, you know, for action or against action altogether, or even denial, you know, I guess as well. So, David, I'm curious, what do you think about this political discourse that has come around climate change?
There's no question at all, Paul, that the discourse is polarized around climate change. But from my perspective, it's actually not a difficult political issue. Certainly not in Canada and in most developed countries. The difficulty around climate change action is the inequitable impact of climate, and Rosemary has, you know, really articulately just spoken to a lot of that. It's true within rich Western countries as well. There's a real differential in impact. But the vast majority of people understand the science and demand action. And we saw that in Canada's last federal election, where you know, the vast majority of people voted for parties that had a really robust and coherent climate change plan. I think where there is some political difficulty is in real action. There's a clear public consensus that we have to act. Yes, there's a small group who's fighting a pitch battle, mostly funded by the owners of some parts of fossil fuel industry, some parts. I don't want to brush them all with the same brush, but some of them. But moving from a general belief that we have to address this to real action is the political challenge, because some of those actions have a differential negative impact on a particular group, even though they have a beneficial impact for society environmentally and economically. For example, a transition from using polluting fuels to clean fuels. There are lots of studies show there are more jobs in generating power by clean ways than there are in coal. But what happens to a community? Let's take a community in Alberta that has a coal mine and a coal-fired power plant. What happens to those people? And I think sometimes in the debate, we forget to both include them in the conversation, include their needs, and think about very specific remedies. It doesn't help people in that place to say there's 100,000 new jobs doing green energy in Ontario. What helps people in that place is to say, you know what? we're going to make you the Canadian center of manufacturing wind turbines and use similar skills so that you and your family will continue to have a future for generations. And to me, the political challenge has been creating those kinds of solutions. And I think the good news is that we see lots of solutions happening in cities that meet that sort of green and just criteria. And there's something to build from a global perspective. But to me, that's the political challenge, and it's one of inclusion, equity, justice, and fairness.
And that sort of leads, I guess, if you, I just with Rosemary, because I think we can build off this. I mean, I think you're absolutely right that David, that polling and also how people voted in the last election shows that there's a lot of will for action on climate change. I guess the only slight caveat to that is in Alberta and Saskatchewan in particular in Canada, there was suggestion through their votes that they weren't necessarily looking for the same type of action. So I'm wondering that, and some people have even taken it to the next level to say that this is a national unity issue. So I'm wondering, and you, David, you mentioned a bunch of good ideas, but Rosemary, what can be done to sort of bridge that divide so Canada isn't divided going forward, and rightly or wrongly that we don't have the country sort of torn apart by this particular issue?
Well, I fully agree with David, is that let's stop debating the science. The science is getting more and more precise. Let's debate what are we going to do about it together, and move past this kind of silly conversation to a really substantive conversation. And David has proposed some really good public policy that we need to think about as we move to and transition with difficulty to a green economy. But it's not just an internal debate, because the reality is that the markets are also making decisions about our resource economy. And so whether it's the Norwegian sovereign funds and other investors, they're saying we're not going to put money into carbon intensive industries anymore. And so it's not just a Canadian government decision. The markets are also speaking. And so these externalities, these shocks that are coming in from the external, particularly the financial markets making their choices about where they're going to invest, it's now incumbent on us to kind of, figure out how can we be the most competitive marketplace for those investment funds in the transition to the green economy, as opposed to battling these rear guard battles where the world has moved on, and these decisions are being taken outside of Canada.
Let's keep talking about collective action at the global stage, and I'm going to sort of compress a number of questions that I have and ask you actually both of you to respond to them. So starting off with the Paris Accord, 180 countries joined. Wonderful. President Trump pulled out of the agreement. President Biden rejoined the agreement. Can you, both of you, reflect on, what were the significant advances made by the world writ large with the Paris Accord, and what hopes and aspirations do you have now that President Biden has rejoined, and what are some of the challenges that are political in nature? I realize the science is out there, but it's the political nitpicking and positioning and that seems to get in the way of collective action. So both of you, I hope you will give us radically different answers, because I want to get the richness of the debate here.
Who would you like to go first?
Rosemary, why don't you go first?
David. Couple of things I would say. I mean, I was just, when you were phrasing the question, Ratna, I was thinking, oh, the good old days of 2015 when we were also young and naive. Because of course the 20.
Well, we may have been naive, Rosemary, but I wasn't young. I'm not going to claim that.
Relatively speaking, but boy, it's been a long time since 2015, And the commitments made, that massive global consensus in 2015, there was a lot going on in 2015, a global consensus on sustainable development goals, which are also important to this conversation on climate change, and then the Paris Agreement. And you know, there were major, at the time, what was seen as pretty major commitments. There were still compromises between the 2 degrees and the 1.5 degrees. There were lots of puts and takes, but there were significant national commitments made. And what's happened is the science has gotten better. And as you say, citizens around the world are observing what's happening in their own backyard as well as further afield. And we know that those commitments were not nearly enough. The acceleration of what's happening in terms of the harmful effects of climate change are becoming more and more evident. So the 2020 follow-up to the Paris Agreement was supposed to take place in November, and we had a global pandemic that shut the world down, with implications of climate change and its impact on COVID, which is still being revealed. And so we bought ourselves a year, collectively, the world. So we're now meeting in Glasgow, one believes, next November instead, or a 12-month delay. So it's going to be interesting to see. But if you look at China and if you look at Canada, other countries, they've upped their commitments in terms of getting to net zero carbon emissions. And so it's going to be interesting to see what's in the luggage that goes into COP26 in November. But I think we should also be watching the private sector because they're moving so quickly. So I mentioned the financial markets, but look at the auto industry and what it's doing, and it's moving faster than the political machinery. And so I think it's going to be interesting, and it's a healthy foot race to green economies, or more sustainable, let's say more sustainable economies. It's a good foot race to be in.
So I have a slightly different perspective. The Paris was good and important because the national governments actually agreed, and people in the advocacy world all bit their tongues and said this is great, because it was hoped that the fact there was agreement would be a signpost, so the private sector and others would be empowered to really deliver on climate. But the truth was a bit sad that even the agreements in Paris weren't good enough. And we're at a place today where over the next decade, the world needs roughly to half emissions. So we're at a place today where we need action. And, you know, there's another way to look at these conferences of the parties, the COPs, which are the mandated process under the UN climate agreement to reach certain signposts, which is that they've been a complete and utter failure, a dismal failure. You know, Paris, we all celebrated agreement. That was COP21. It took 21 years after reaching agreement that climate change was a problem to reach an agreement that everybody knew wasn't good enough. I mean, it's an astonishing indictment of the failure of the international system. Now, like others, I'm optimistic that this year's conference, which was last year's, as Rosemary pointed out, it's called COP26, but it's actually now 27 years since national governments agreed that this was a dire crisis that we had to act on with urgency. I'm optimistic that the national governments are all going to say by 2050 we'll be net zero. That's great. But the reality is that we need action today. And I think, in fact, I would argue very strongly that action, for the most part, is going to be driven by our urban areas, by our city governments, by businesses that are aligned with that movement, empowered by the fact that national governments have said it's okay. But 2050 is too late. We need to be net zero by then. But what happens over the next 5 years and the next 10 are really what matters. And that's what we need to do. And that's what, in the run-up to Glasgow in November this year, that's what people need to be announcing, is real action, not just commitments.
So, David, that's a wonderful lead-in to my next question. You talked about the failure of international regimes, and you talked about the success of local municipalities. You're the CEO of C40, a group of cities that are committed to climate change. Take a run at some of the best ideas that local municipalities have implemented that could so easily be transported, replicated, disseminated to cities around the world. So, there's the famous line, while prime ministers and presidents, engage in fruitless debate, cities take up the action and prove that things can be done. So give us some optimism here.
Sure. And I have to give a bit of preface to that, if it's okay, Senator, but I fully agree. Cities are places for action. People elect mayors to act. They don't elect them to talk for 21 years. I mean, you can't. I mean, you've got to deliver water, social services, public housing, public transport, public safety, ambulances. You can't wait 21 years to decide whether you have an ambulance fleet. The context is, as of about 2008, 2009, most of the world, for the very first time ever, lived in urban areas because of some of the migrations you were talking about earlier and some other reasons. So the world is predominantly urban. Most of the greenhouse gas emissions are either in urban areas or accounted for by the activities needed to sustain them, like electricity plants, even if they're outside the urban area. And most of those are in the areas of buildings, transportation, how we generate electricity, and how we manage our waste. So what's happened since Paris is that the leading cities of the world have said, we are going to draft plans that address the greenhouse gas emissions within our control and try to influence the ones outside our control in those areas. And as of today, 54 of the C40 cities, and C40 represents about 750 million people. So it's like a really huge country, probably the most significant country in the world collectively. 54 of those cities have plans that peak emissions by 2020, do their fair share of having them by 2030, and go to net zero by 2050. 2 countries in the world have those plans, 2. So there's a reason for optimism because cities are actually getting on with it. So to answer your question, Senator, what are some really good examples? I'd like to give 3 if I could. A few years ago, cities really pushed on electric buses. There were a few, and that was it. And bus manufacturers said, we're decades away. But the mayor said, no, we're going to procure them. We're going to put out procurements. And within intercity collaboration, but in which China is really the leader, there are now 66,000 electric buses in service in public transport agencies around the world, led by Shenzhen, China, which has gone from 0 to 16,000 electric buses, and it's electrified its entire taxi fleet as well. And so we see cities like London, England, electrifying its taxi fleet, and the manufacturer of those iconic black London cabs about 2 years ago opened a new plant just to manufacture electric cabs. So there was a very direct connection with jobs, employment, income, those kinds of things. We see New York City has got, I think, 12,000 vehicles, not in its bus fleet, in its regular fleet of vehicles. And that all came about because of city-to-city ideas. A couple more, if I might. Second one is Toronto. The biggest sector, and it's not discussed nearly often enough because it's not as interesting as Teslas or solar panels, but the biggest sector for emissions in cities is the built environment buildings. And Toronto has had a program. In fact, Jack Layton was one of the city councillors who pushed it, along with some others, in the late 80s, early 90s, called the Better Buildings Partnership, which is a partnership between the city government, between building owners of commercial buildings, the gas company, to use far less gas in heating and cooling, well, particularly heating, office towers. That idea I presented at a conference in around 2007, and the then mayor of Melbourne said, I like that. And he took it to Melbourne, and they created their own Better Buildings Partnership. Sydney saw it and said, we like that. And so this idea of this voluntary driven partnership with business to lower their costs of business by using less pollution has been driven globally, and it's a really important greenhouse gas reduction tool. And again, it creates jobs, economic opportunity, and lots of positive spin-off. And the third one is one I'm hoping spreads. You know, in response to the pandemic, mayors have been thinking about how do we ensure that the recovery from the pandemic is one that helps us to overcome climate change and also address inequities. The buzzwords are green and just recovery. And the mayor of Lisbon is a fantastic mayor, and he has really pushed this. He's using European stimulus funds to build public transport. You know, at a time when ridership is down, he's looking to the future. But he has a fantastic housing idea. And it's important from an environmental perspective that people live near where they work. If you build cities that people can walk and bicycle around, they're far more environmentally sustainable. They're actually better places to live. They're more economically successful. So what he's done, it's more complicated than this. I'm way oversimplifying, but he's essentially banned short-term rentals like Airbnb, and then used those private apartments, the government rents them, and then rents them at a subsidy to low-income working people who work in the city, but were having to live outside the city because of affordability of housing. So he's created a whole system of affordable housing in Lisbon by repurposing existing units that were rented to tourists. It's a rather brilliant measure, and I think that's one that could catch fire and spread globally.
Certainly could catch fire in Toronto. I'm sure you're making sure Mayor Tory knows about this, but all of us will now do that. Paul?
Good.
Yeah, Rosemary, I was just wondering about, as a former ambassador and as a former diplomat, what was your sort of response, I guess, to sort of David's, I guess, critique about the international efforts on climate change, and I guess also, what is sort of the next steps, I guess, internationally that should be done that you think would be necessary to continue the momentum that perhaps Paris started, and hopefully the conference in November will continue?
Well, I completely agree with David. I mean, when you're dealing with 193 countries, you're always battling the race to the lowest common denominator. Paris wasn't the lowest common denominator, but I think anyone who understood knew it wasn't enough, but knew that if you could come out of that with a global consensus and get all the countries of the world to agree to work even harder, but maybe not hard enough. And then what we've seen is actually people are coming back in the 5.5 years with better commitments that they didn't make in 2015, but the evidence keeps rolling in. So is it enough? No, it wasn't enough. Will it be enough next year? Not so sure. So, I mean, we need to keep trying to forge a global consensus on this. Some countries are better able to mitigate and manage and transition. But the other part of this is how do we, with our official development assistance across the world, with the wealthier countries, the OECD countries, etc., actually help build more resilience and capacity in the poorer countries of the world so they can also both implement and manage ongoing commitments. So, there's a lot to be done without question. I just think the evidence is less controversial now. It's compelling. And so I think the world has changed a lot since 2015. And so I'm the eternal optimist in the multilateral system, that the multilateral system has to set a frame, but where the rubber hits the road is in small businesses, large businesses, municipalities, etc. That's where the real action is right now, without question.
So it's interesting that both of you are optimistic. David with his optimism about what can happen, how measures, big and small, can change people's lives at a local level, and the action of some, enlightened mayors, hopefully a positive virus spreading around the world. You're optimistic about multilateralism. You've written, Rosemary, that global governance has to shift and adapt to the new reality. Let's talk a bit about the UNHCR protocol for refugees, which at this point does not include, climate change is not a UNHCR sanctioned reason to claim refugee status. You and I both also know that any efforts to expand or change or shift the convention will likely not be a positive outcome. So what's left for the many displaced people? I mean, let's think just of those parts of the world that are already in conflict, the Rohingya, on an island, located on an island in Bangladesh that is likely going to sink sometime, who knows? Is a side protocol something that multilateral ambassadors like you know, ambassadors of multilateralism, can conceive and work on?
Well, Senator, you're absolutely right. Most would agree that there's a legal gap in the international system that is somewhere between voluntary migration, economic migration, social migration, and the Refugee Convention of 1951, which was all about persecution and human rights abuses, etc. And so the climate forcibly displaced, and there's a range in that middle of that spectrum, that there is a legal gap in protection of those folks who are forcibly displaced due to a compelling part of it being climate displacement, because people move for a variety of reasons and are forcibly displaced for a number of reasons. But what we've been talking about is whether or not we couldn't conceive of a category that we could trial. And with Canadian leadership, it's an opportunity because we have credibility and we've got a societal consensus around the importance, the value, the humanity, etc. of refugees and migration. And so what if we ran a pilot that actually looked at some of the elements where climate change, environmental degradation was a compelling inflection point in seeking asylum, even though there might be others, and created the category and tested it out in Canada under our current caps, etc., that created a category of climate refugee. And you know, UNHCR and the International Organization for Migration, both are working hard on this to try and fill the gap, but they're somewhat at the mercy of member states on this, and you know, you don't want to open existing protocols, etc. But if we could run a pilot and show success, and then bring on other like-minded countries, like say the Nordics, etc., to also pilot this, then we're creating an evidentiary base to go back into the multilateral world with what could be a framework convention, a protocol, etc., that would come out of the agreements on the global compacts on migration and refugees, which were signed only 24 months ago, that created alternative, safe, dignified pathways that offered protection to this class of migration, somewhere between voluntary and somewhere between refugee, but that would give them the protection that they need from forcible displacement. And we need to get out ahead of this, Senator, because the numbers are quite frankly all over the map. So we shouldn't talk in terms of this specific number in the next 5 years or 10 years, but we are talking in the tens and hundreds of millions. I mean, even if you take the most conservative range or the most aggressive range and the extrapolations which can be disputed, we're talking about tens and tens of millions of people who are going to be forcibly displaced. So what are we going to do about it? And how can we create the pathways through some safe, reasonable, constrained, thoughtful pilots where we actually are able to provide the international world with the data?
That is really a sensible way of moving forward, and I really wish that such a pilot comes around. I want to close with a question to David around domestic migration. Let's just talk about Canada. Climate change is everywhere. Do you see more domestic migration in Canada, places that are beset by extreme weather or sea level rising, where we are a country with many coasts? Do you see that happening with or without the interventions that we've talked about, is it inevitable in a way? That's what I'm asking. Is it inevitable that we will have to all move somewhere to be safer?
I think if we can broaden this slightly, Senator, to think about environmental stresses and climate change, I think there are some very real worries. You know, the small fishing villages in Newfoundland, for example. When I was at WWF, we were doing a project to try to help the cod fishery become sustainable. And we visited a small village that had been there, I think, since 1656 or something. And basically everybody there lost their jobs in 1989. Literally everybody. And there's been a push now and then to try and essentially shut down all these places and have people come to the cities. But people don't want that. They value their place. It's part of their soul. And I worry about that. It is true. It's also true as the oil industry in Canada is under more and more pressure from international sources and finds it harder and harder to get capital. And as we use less and less oil, you know, those communities are going to be under pressure. And the impact of climate change on Canada itself in terms of our climate is very region dependent. You'll see some crops moving in Saskatchewan, which will also push people to move north. Very serious problems in the north with permafrost. China coming through the Northwest Passage. Chinese shipping, what impact's that going to have, and what's it going to have on those northern communities where people actually depend on the ice? You know, a right to be cold kind of argument. So I think there's some very complicated questions, and they are a worry because they just don't get enough thoughtful attention. You know, how can we support fairly remote places that people are actually connected to and their heritage is connected to? How do we do that in the face of these really significant changing environmental challenges, including the disappearance of local food in the case of the North, which is entirely possible? I don't have the answer to that as easily as I do to how we mitigate against climate change, which I see quite clearly. But it's a really critical question for this country because that's part of our soul and of who we are, really.
So thank you, both of you. It's been a fascinating conversation, a really important subject, and I'm thinking that, with you as climate activists, as thought leaders, and with your colleagues, because there's a whole community, we are not bereft of ideas. Maybe we just require greater political will, whether that political will is local, national, or global. Thank you so much for joining us. To our listeners, please continue to listen to us. We will have more fascinating guests in the near future, and I welcome you to write to me about your suggestions about who you'd like to hear from. We will continue to bring Moving the Needle to you as we examine all the many problems and the many solutions that are available to us in our country and in the globe. Thank you.